She had spent the entire day in court, moving from one case to another, hearing stories that ranged from the heartbreaking to the absurd. Her job demanded patience, sharp attention, and fairness. It was a life she had chosen long ago, not for fame or recognition, but because she believed in justice. People trusted her to be wise, to listen, and to make decisions that affected lives in real ways. By the time the courtroom emptied, she was exhausted, but she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had done her duty well. The city had a rhythm of its own at night. The streets were quieter, but there was still the hum of life, occasional cars passing, distant sirens, a dog barking somewhere down a side street. She liked this hour. It was her moment of calm before heading home. She walked at a steady pace, hands tucked into her coat pockets, her mind drifting to thoughts of dinner and rest. As she turned a corner near a dimly lit alley, she noticed a patrol car slowly approaching. 2 officers inside seemed tense, their eyes tracking her movements. At first, she thought nothing of it. Police presence was normal in this part of the city, and they probably had a routine to follow, but then the car stopped abruptly, blocking her path. "Excuse me, ma'am. Step over here," one of the officers said, his voice firm and unyielding. She raised her hand slightly, signaling compliance but also confusion. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked politely. "You don't look familiar around here. We need to check you out," the other officer replied. Her heart sank slightly. She had never had trouble with the law, had never been anything other than a law-abiding citizen, yet now she felt the weight of suspicion fall on her, unearned and unjust. She reached for her identification in her purse. "Just a moment," she said, handing over her ID. The officers glanced at it, but instead of acknowledging it, they exchanged a look and said, "Step out of the coat." She froze. "Excuse me?" "Take off your coat." "Now," one officer repeated, this time with a tone that left no room for discussion. Her confusion turned into alarm. She felt a flicker of fear. Something about the way they moved, the way their hands rested near their belts, made her instinct scream that this was not routine. But she had learned to stay calm, to assess the situation before reacting. She tried to reason with them. "I'm just on my way home. I have identification right here. There's no need for—" Before she could finish, they grabbed her roughly, pulling her coat from her shoulders. Panic rose in her chest as she realized the situation was escalating. She tried to step back, but they blocked her. People passing by slowed down, some staring, others moving quickly away, sensing trouble but unsure what it was. The officers began to speak in a low, harsh tone, accusing her of resisting. She tried to explain, but they didn't listen. Words felt useless. The fear in her chest turned into a strange, sharp clarity. She understood then that arguing would not help. She had to survive the moment. One of the officers pulled something from his pocket, a small pair of clippers. The sudden sight made her heart stop. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You need to be taught a lesson," he said coldly. She looked around desperately, hoping someone nearby would intervene, but the streets were emptying fast. The distant hum of the city felt like a cruel joke. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had dedicated her life to the law, yet here she was, powerless against people sworn to uphold it. Her thoughts flashed to her family, to her parents, to the countless people who had relied on her judgment. She wondered how this could happen in a world that claimed justice mattered. She felt anger rise, but more than that, a deep, raw sense of disbelief. The officers began to act, and she felt the first sting as they forcibly clipped her hair. The sound of the clippers was loud, harsh, filling the night air. Strands of hair fell to the ground around her, and with each passing second, she felt a part of her dignity stripped away. She tried to stay calm, tried to remember that this was temporary, that she would survive this, but the humiliation was crushing. As they continued, she noticed a passerby filming with their phone. Relief mixed with shame. At least there was evidence. At least the world would see what was happening. But in that moment, the fear was all-consuming. She was alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of people who had no respect for her identity, her role, or her life. Her mind wandered to her first days as a judge. She had faced challenges, discrimination, and skepticism, but nothing like this. She had learned to stand tall, to speak with authority, to command respect in courtrooms full of tension. But here, in the dark streets, all that experience felt irrelevant. She was just a person in front of those who chose to see her as less hours, or maybe it was only minutes. Later, it was over. The officers stepped back, seemingly satisfied with their work. She stood in the middle of the sidewalk, her hair uneven, her coat disheveled, her spirit shaken but not broken. The passerby who had filmed the incident approached and handed her a phone. "Here," they said. "People need to see this." She nodded, barely able to speak. She thanked them softly, then began walking home, her steps slow but determined. Every sound, every shadow felt amplified. She knew she would never forget this night. It had been a stark lesson in the fragility of safety and the unpredictable nature of injustice. When she finally reached her apartment, she locked the door and sat down, trembling. She ran her hands through what remained of her hair, feeling the emptiness of loss but also the strength she had always carried. She realized that while they had tried to humiliate her, they had underestimated her resilience. This would not define her. It would not break her. As she cleaned up and prepared for the night, her thoughts shifted from fear to strategy. She knew she had to act. She had to make sure that what happened to her would not happen to anyone else. She would use every tool at her disposal, every bit of knowledge and authority she had earned over the years to seek justice, and she would do it not out of revenge, but out of a sense of duty to the law she had devoted her life to uphold. In the quiet of her apartment, she allowed herself a moment of sorrow, a brief acknowledgement of the pain inflicted upon her, but it was fleeting. She had learned long ago that sorrow without action was meaningless. Action required clarity, courage, and patience. She was determined to embody all three in the days to come. She thought about her colleagues at the courthouse, her friends, and the community that relied on her. They would be shocked, horrified, and outraged. But she also knew that anger alone would not solve the problem. It would take strategy, careful planning, and the courage to confront those who had wronged her directly. She had faced tough cases before, and she would face this with the same unflinching resolve. By the time she finally rested, the first light of dawn was breaking. The city was awakening, unaware of the injustice that had occurred the night before. She stared out of her window at the streets below, thinking about how fragile civility could be, how quickly respect could be stripped away when people allowed fear and prejudice to guide their actions. And yet, she also thought about resilience, about justice, and about the power of standing tall even when others tried to make her small. She knew this was only the beginning. The night's events would ripple outward, touching many lives, stirring conversations, and forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. And she would be at the center, not as a victim, but as a force for accountability, fairness, and change. In the weeks that followed, she would navigate a system that was often slow, sometimes resistant and frequently imperfect, but she had faced challenges before, and she would face this one too. Her resolve was unshaken, her purpose clear, and her heart set on ensuring that justice, however delayed, would be served. And as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, hair uneven but spirit intact, she smiled faintly. They had taken her hair, but they could not take her dignity, her intellect, or her unwavering commitment to justice. That, she knew, was something no one could ever shave away. The morning after the incident was different from any other day for the officers involved. The city was waking up to its usual rhythm, unaware that a mistake of enormous consequence had been made the night before. At the precinct, there was tension, though none of the officers spoke openly about it. Some avoided eye contact, others fidgeted nervously with papers or coffee cups. No one had yet realized the full scope of what had happened, but an uneasy feeling hung in the air. Then the call came. One officer's phone rang sharply, breaking the silence. It was the department's internal affairs unit, asking for the names of everyone involved in the patrol the previous night. As he read the names aloud, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. They were about to be investigated for misconduct, but no one had yet connected the dots to the woman's true identity. Meanwhile, Judge Harris went about her day as she always did, though her mind was still haunted by what had happened. She felt the sting of humiliation, yes, but she also felt an urgent need to act. She called her assistant and asked them to gather all relevant information, news reports, videos from witnesses, and statements from people who had seen the incident. The social media posts were already spreading, with dozens of videos showing her standing frozen as her hair was cut against her will. People were angry, horrified, and deeply sympathetic. As she reviewed the footage, she noticed small details she had not seen clearly in the chaos. The patrol car's number, the badges of the officers, even the exact location where it had happened. Every detail mattered. She knew that one misstep could allow the officers to escape accountability. She also knew that the law worked differently outside the courtroom, and she would need to navigate this carefully. Back at the precinct, word began to circulate. A young officer who had watched the footage shared it quietly with a sergeant. The room went silent. One officer muttered, "Wait, is that her?" Another officer leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "No, it can't be. That's Judge Harris. She's the one presiding over the case on the misconduct investigation we're handling." The first officer froze. "You mean, we just—" His voice trailed off, disbelief written across his face. Yes. They had humiliated the very person entrusted to judge them. The realization hit like a physical blow. Panic replaced arrogance, fear replaced bravado. The officers looked at one another, unsure whether to laugh nervously or run. They were no longer in control. The irony of the situation was staggering. The person they had treated with violence and disrespect was now in a position of absolute authority over them. The precinct superintendent called an emergency meeting. Officers gathered in a conference room, their faces pale, voices low, and hands restless. Internal Affairs had already started an inquiry, but this was no ordinary review. This was a crisis, and it involved one of the city's most respected judges. Meanwhile, Judge Harris had begun drafting a formal complaint. She knew that filing a complaint was only the first step. She would also need to prepare for public scrutiny, media attention, and the inevitable backlash. But she felt steady, composed, and clear about her goals. Justice, not revenge, would guide her actions. By late morning, news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines ran across the city's papers and websites. Judge humiliated by police. Officers mistakenly target presiding judge. Outrage as video of incident goes viral. The city's residents were stunned. Social media erupted with anger, with people demanding accountability, respect, and immediate action. Protesters began organizing, gathering near the courthouse and the precinct, chanting slogans and waving signs. Judge Harris knew she needed to act quickly to prevent the story from spinning out of control. She called her legal team and began coordinating with the court's administrative office. She wanted to ensure the matter would be handled properly with full transparency and no room for anyone to hide behind excuses. Her calm and strategic approach contrasted sharply with the growing panic among the officers. Inside the precinct, the officers involved were placed on administrative leave. It was a move meant to calm the public and protect the integrity of the investigation, but it did little to soothe their own nerves. Every time someone mentioned the judge's name, a hush fell over the room. Some officers avoided going to work entirely, fearing that they might be recognized or held accountable. Rumors spread about possible lawsuits, criminal charges, and public censure. Judge Harris, meanwhile, made a public statement. She spoke with clarity and poise, describing the incident in a measured tone, emphasizing that the law must apply equally to everyone, including those who enforce it. She acknowledged the emotional weight of the situation, but focused on the principles of justice and accountability. Her words resonated deeply with the public, earning her admiration and support across the city. The officers' realization of who they had wronged did not come with instant solutions. They had humiliated a judge, and their actions would now be scrutinized from every angle. Internal Affairs conducted interviews, gathering testimonies from witnesses and analyzing video evidence. Every detail of the night was under the microscope. The officers, who had once felt untouchable, now faced the possibility of criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and permanent damage to their careers. Judge Harris, in her office, felt a mixture of emotions. There was anger, yes, but also clarity and determination. She knew that this was bigger than a personal affront. It was a reflection of a system that allowed bias, carelessness, and abuse of power to thrive unchecked. She would not allow this moment to pass without consequence. Her role as a judge gave her authority, but she also felt the weight of responsibility to ensure the outcome would serve justice, not vengeance. The city's reaction added another layer of pressure. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens rallied behind Judge Harris. They held meetings, organized vigils, and wrote letters demanding that the officers be held accountable. Social media campaigns spread the story nationwide, prompting discussions about systemic issues in policing, racial bias, and the importance of respecting authority and human dignity. Inside the precinct, the officers struggled with their new reality. Some admitted privately that they had acted out of fear or misjudgment. Others tried to deflect blame, pointing fingers at one another. But no excuse could erase the fact that they had targeted someone who had devoted her life to upholding the law. Their arrogance, ignorance, and failure to verify identity had put them in the most ironic and humiliating position imaginable. Judge Harris, meanwhile, prepared for the next steps. She scheduled meetings with her legal team, reviewed procedural documents, and began preparing for court hearings. She was acutely aware that the officers would have their own representation, but she also knew that the truth, backed by evidence, would be on her side. Every video clip, every witness statement, and every detail of the incident had been carefully documented. As the day turned to evening, Judge Harris reflected on the events. She had endured humiliation, but she had also gained clarity. This incident, though painful, was an opportunity to shine a light on injustice and demand accountability. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She had the chance to turn a personal violation into a powerful lesson about law, respect, and equality. The officers, meanwhile, were learning their own harsh lesson. Their actions had consequences, and those consequences were unavoidable. They were no longer operating in a world where authority automatically protected them. They were subject to the same laws and scrutiny that they had once enforced, now under the careful gaze of the very person they had wronged. As night fell over the city, Judge Harris prepared for another day of hearings and meetings. She knew that the coming weeks would be challenging, but she felt ready. Her resolve had strengthened. She would face the officers, the public, and the media with dignity and precision. She would ensure that justice was served, not just for herself, but for everyone who could be affected by this abuse of power. The incident had exposed vulnerabilities in the system, but it had also revealed the strength of one person determined to uphold the law. Judge Harris understood that the path ahead would be difficult, that some would resist change, and that her patience and wisdom would be tested. But she was prepared. She had spent her life preparing for moments like this, where fairness, courage, and persistence mattered more than fear, anger, or humiliation. In the quiet moments before sleep, she allowed herself a brief reflection. She thought of her colleagues who respected her, the citizens who trusted her judgment, and the countless cases she had handled with fairness and empathy. She thought of the officers who had underestimated her and the consequences that awaited them. And she thought of herself standing tall despite the odds, ready to transform a moment of personal pain into a force for justice that would resonate far beyond the streets where it had begun. The city had seen a shocking event, and the officers had faced a harsh revelation. But the story was just beginning. Judge Harris's courage, intelligence, and unyielding sense of justice would guide the next steps. The officers' fate hung in the balance, and the public waited, watching closely. As the wheels of accountability began to turn, the lesson was clear. Actions have consequences, and no one, not even those entrusted with enforcing the law, is above the truth. And Judge Harris, who had been humiliated but not defeated, was ready to make sure that truth was seen, heard, and respected. The city had not forgotten the incident, and neither had the people. News coverage continued to spread, showing the video of the judge being humiliated, capturing the shock and disbelief that resonated with viewers. Social media posts multiplied by the hour, and hashtags calling for justice trended nationwide. Citizens debated, commented, and shared, expressing outrage at the abuse of power they had witnessed. The atmosphere was tense, and the officers who had committed the act felt the growing weight of scrutiny pressing down on them. Judge Harris moved with calm determination. She knew that the court of public opinion could only carry her so far. True justice would be served in the legal system, and that required careful preparation. She spent hours reviewing the incident from every possible angle. The videos, the witness statements, and the timeline of events were organized meticulously. Every detail mattered, and she made sure nothing could be misinterpreted. Her team of legal advisors worked alongside her, strategizing how to handle the upcoming hearings. They discussed options for disciplinary action, civil suits, and how to ensure the officers could not evade responsibility. Judge Harris listened carefully, asking questions and suggesting adjustments, showing a level of clarity and precision that reminded everyone why she had earned her position. She was resolute but never reckless. Her focus was on justice, not vengeance. Meanwhile, the officers were growing increasingly anxious. Their public image was crumbling, and they could feel the weight of each comment, each news article, and each social media post. Some avoided leaving their homes, afraid they would be recognized and confronted. Others tried to brush off the incident, telling themselves it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, they knew the truth. They had crossed a line, and it could not be undone. At the courthouse, preparations were underway. Security was heightened, and staff were briefed on what to expect. Judge Harris wanted the hearings to be orderly, respectful, and focused on the facts. She knew emotions would run high, both from the public and from the officers involved, but she was determined to maintain control of the situation. Her years of experience had prepared her for tense courtrooms, but this was different. This was personal, yet she was determined not to let it cloud her judgment. The day of the first hearing arrived. The courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and officials. Cameras clicked, microphones recorded, and the air was thick with anticipation. Judge Harris entered the room, her presence commanding attention. Her hair, though still uneven from the night of the incident, did not diminish her authority. People watched in awe as she took her seat, calm and composed, exuding a quiet strength that seemed to settle the room. The officers were brought in, each wearing a tense expression. They avoided eye contact, their usual confidence replaced by nervousness. They knew that the judge before them was the same person they had humiliated, and that she now held the power to determine their future. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Judge Harris began by recounting the events of the night in a clear and measured tone. She described what had happened step by step, without allowing her personal feelings to dominate her words. She presented the evidence, the videos, witness statements, and official reports. Every piece reinforced the reality of what had occurred and left little room for denial. The officers attempted to explain themselves. One said it was a misunderstanding, another claimed they acted out of fear, and a third tried to minimize the incident. But their excuses fell flat. The video evidence spoke for itself, and the witness accounts corroborated the events. The courtroom audience murmured as the officers' arguments weakened under scrutiny. Judge Harris listened patiently, then addressed them directly. Her voice was firm but measured, reflecting both authority and fairness. She reminded them that their duty was to uphold the law, protect citizens, and act with integrity. Instead, they had abused their power and humiliated someone who had dedicated her life to justice. Her words were not just a rebuke. They were a lesson in responsibility and consequence. Outside the courtroom, the public response continued to grow. Protesters gathered, chanting and holding signs demanding accountability. Community leaders spoke to the press, praising Judge Harris for her courage and calling for systemic reforms in the police department. The city felt the ripple effects of the incident, as citizens began to question the accountability of those sworn to protect them. Back in the courtroom, the hearings continued. Judge Harris questioned witnesses, reviewed additional evidence, and allowed the officers to respond. She maintained strict control over the proceedings, ensuring that respect and order were preserved. Her composure never wavered, even as emotions ran high around her. It became clear to everyone present that she was not just seeking personal justice. She was setting a precedent for accountability and fairness that would resonate far beyond this single case. The officers' defense team tried various strategies, but nothing could negate the overwhelming evidence. They attempted to cast doubt on minor details, but Judge Harris anticipated every move, prepared with documentation and legal precedent. She dismantled their arguments methodically, showing both the depth of her knowledge and her unwavering commitment to justice. Throughout the hearings, the human element of the story became clear. Judge Harris's dignity and composure contrasted sharply with the fear and arrogance of the officers. Observers noted how she maintained empathy, even for those who had wronged her, emphasizing that justice should never be about revenge, but about fairness, accountability, and the protection of rights. Her actions inspired admiration, not just for her professional skill, but for her character. As the hearings progressed, the officers began to realize the full weight of their mistake. They were no longer in a position of authority. They were being held accountable under the law, facing consequences for actions they had taken without thought or restraint. Fear and regret replaced the initial sense of power they had wielded. They understood that this would affect their careers, their reputations, and their personal lives. The reality of accountability had arrived. Judge Harris also reflected on the broader implications of the incident. This was more than a personal case, it was a moment that could drive systemic change. She considered the reforms that could be implemented in the police department to prevent similar incidents in the future. She thought about training, oversight, and the culture of accountability that was necessary to ensure that power was exercised responsibly. She understood that change would not happen overnight, but every action she took could contribute to a safer, more just system. The courtroom became a place of learning and reflection. People who had once trusted authority without question were forced to confront the reality of abuse and negligence. Officers who had believed they were untouchable were reminded that no one is above the law, and the public saw firsthand how courage, preparation, and steadfast commitment to justice could overcome fear, intimidation, and wrongdoing. By the end of the day, the hearings had set a clear tone. Judge Harris had established control, maintained fairness, and demonstrated the power of accountability. The officers were left to face the consequences of their actions, knowing that their misconduct had been exposed to the full view of the law and the public. They could no longer hide behind uniforms or authority. They were, for the first time, subject to the justice they had once enforced. Outside the courthouse, people discussed the proceedings with a mixture of awe and relief. Many expressed gratitude for Judge Harris's leadership, noting that her handling of the situation had not only addressed a personal injustice, but had also sent a message about the importance of integrity, responsibility, and courage. Community members felt empowered, realizing that the law could work in their favor when wielded by someone who truly understood its purpose. Judge Harris returned to her office, exhausted but focused. She knew that more challenges lay ahead, but she also recognized that this day had marked a turning point. The officers had been confronted with their wrongdoing, the public had witnessed accountability, and the system had begun to respond. It was a moment that would resonate long after the incident itself had faded from the headlines. She allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, thinking about the night that had started it all. The fear, the humiliation, and the anger were still present, but they were tempered by clarity and resolve. She had faced a personal violation and turned it into an opportunity for justice. She had maintained dignity in the face of injustice, and had shown that true authority comes not from power, but from wisdom, fairness, and courage. The city continued to watch. The officers continued to reckon with their actions, and Judge Harris continued her work with unwavering focus. The story had moved beyond a single incident. It had become a symbol of accountability, integrity, and the enduring importance of justice in a society that often struggles to uphold it. In quiet moments, she thought about the lessons this experience had brought, the importance of preparation, the necessity of courage, and the impact of a single act of wrongdoing when left unchecked. She considered how these lessons could be shared, how the system could be improved, and how future officers could be trained to respect authority, dignity, and the law. As night fell, Judge Harris prepared for the next day of hearings. The officer's fate was still being decided, and the city's eyes were upon her. But she felt ready. She had faced humiliation, public scrutiny, and the challenge of holding those in power accountable. She had done so with composure, clarity, and unwavering commitment to justice, and she would continue to do so, not for revenge, but for fairness, accountability, and the protection of everyone's rights. This day had shown the power of courage and PR. Preparation. It had revealed the stark contrast between those who abuse authority and those who uphold it. And it had demonstrated in the clearest terms that justice is not abstract, it is human, it is necessary, and it is achievable when guided by integrity and resolve. The day of the courtroom confrontation finally arrived. The city seemed to hold its breath. Word had spread that Judge Harris would personally preside over the case involving the officers who had humiliated her. And the irony of the situation was not lost on anyone. News crews lined the streets outside the courthouse, cameras trained on the entrance, and citizens gathered to witness history unfolding. It was a rare moment when the law's power, the human spirit, and accountability intersected so visibly. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Lawyers prepared their notes, journalists clicked cameras, and the officers sat quietly, their expressions tense. They were facing the very person they had harmed, someone whose authority they had once disregarded. Their confidence from the night of the incident had evaporated, replaced by fear, regret, and a dawning realization that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Judge Harris entered the courtroom with calm authority. She had chosen to keep her composure, to let the events speak for themselves rather than show anger or vulnerability. Her hair, uneven and a visible reminder of the ordeal, did not diminish her presence. It was clear to everyone that the power in the room had shifted entirely. She took her seat, adjusted her papers, and looked at the officers directly, her gaze steady, firm, and unflinching. The proceedings began with formalities, but the tension was palpable. Judge Harris allowed each officer to explain their actions, to give their account of what had happened that night. They spoke haltingly, attempting to justify their behavior, citing fear, confusion, and misunderstanding. But each excuse felt weak, hollow in the face of video evidence and witness statements. The courtroom murmured occasionally, disbelief evident on the faces of those watching. Judge Harris listened patiently. She had spent her life navigating tense courtrooms, but this moment was uniquely personal. Yet she did not let her feelings dominate her judgment. Her voice remained calm, clear, and authoritative as she asked pointed questions, uncovering inconsistencies in the officers' accounts. She asked them to describe why they had acted as they did, why they had failed to verify her identity, and why they had chosen intimidation instead of procedure. The answers were faltering, revealing fear and poor judgment rather than rational reasoning. Throughout the confrontation, the human element of the story was undeniable. Judge Harris's dignity contrasted sharply with the officers' panic. She spoke not only to hold them accountable, but to highlight the principles of fairness, respect, and responsibility that every person in authority must uphold. Her words carried weight not because of anger or vengeance, but because they came from someone whose life was devoted to justice, someone who understood the law intimately and applied it without bias. Witnesses were called next. People who had been present that night recounted what they had seen. Their testimonies were detailed, vivid, and consistent. They described the fear and confusion they had observed, the sheer audacity of the officers' actions, and the humiliation inflicted upon Judge Harris. The courtroom listened, rapt as the human impact of the incident became impossible to ignore. The officers' behavior was no longer an abstract wrongdoing. It was a real violation of someone's dignity and trust. Judge Harris allowed the officers' defense team to respond, but she carefully controlled the proceedings. Every argument was met with evidence, with questions that revealed inconsistencies and highlighted accountability. The courtroom was a lesson in justice in action, showing how authority should be exercised responsibly and how consequences follow when it is abused. The officers were being confronted not just by the law, but by the reality of their own actions. The tension grew as Judge Harris addressed the courtroom, her voice steady and commanding. She spoke about the importance of respect, about the responsibility that comes with power, and about the human consequences of neglecting those responsibilities. Her words were measured, but they cut deep, exposing the moral failure of the officers' choices. She emphasized that justice was not personal revenge, but the application of law guided by fairness and empathy. Outside, the city was watching. News crews broadcast live, showing clips of the proceedings. Citizens followed updates online, discussing every development. Social media was alive with reactions, praise for Judge Harris, and conversations about police accountability. People admired her courage and her ability to maintain composure under such personal strain. She was not just enforcing the law, she was showing the world how justice could work when wielded by someone who truly understood it. Inside the courtroom, the officers began to realize the gravity of their situation. Their arguments faltered, their confidence eroded. Each question from Judge Harris revealed flaws in their reasoning. Each piece of evidence reminded them of the reality they could no longer escape. They were no longer officers with unquestioned authority. They were individuals facing the consequences of choices that had crossed legal and ethical lines. Fear and regret replaced arrogance. Judge Harris's approach was methodical. She balanced firmness with fairness, ensuring the officers were heard but not excused. She asked questions designed to uncover truth, and she allowed witnesses to describe the events in their own words. The courtroom became a stage for clarity, truth, and accountability. It was a moment where personal courage and legal authority intersected, showing how law and humanity could converge to correct wrongdoing. Throughout the day, the public watched closely. The story was no longer just about an incident on a quiet city street. It had become a symbol. It showed what happens when authority is misused and how accountability can be enforced with dignity and courage. Citizens discussed the implications, reflecting on their own interactions with law enforcement and the importance of holding those in power responsible for their actions. Judge Harris also considered the long-term impact of the confrontation. She knew that addressing the officer's misconduct was only part of the solution. She wanted to ensure that the system would prevent similar incidents in the future. She thought about training programs, oversight mechanisms, and cultural changes within the police department. Her focus extended beyond personal justice to broader systemic reform. The officers, aware of the public and legal scrutiny, began to show signs of remorse. Some admitted their mistakes openly, acknowledging that fear and poor judgment had driven their actions. Others struggled, defensive and uncomfortable, but the reality of accountability was undeniable. Judge Harris treated each moment with care, ensuring that the proceedings were thorough, transparent, and fair. By mid-afternoon, the confrontation had reached its peak. Judge Harris summarized the evidence, addressed the officers directly, and highlighted the consequences of their actions. She spoke not as someone seeking revenge, but as a representative of the law, reminding everyone present that authority comes with responsibility and that the abuse of that authority cannot be tolerated. Her words resonated deeply, leaving a lasting impression on both the officers and the public. As the day drew to a close, Judge Harris reflected quietly on the proceedings. She had maintained her composure, upheld fairness, and reinforced the principles she had spent her life defending. She had faced personal humiliation and turned it into an opportunity to teach, to correct, and to demand accountability. The officer's fate was now firmly in the hands of the system, guided by evidence, law, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Outside the courthouse, citizens continued to discuss the events. Some were inspired, seeing in Judge Harris a model of courage and dignity. Others debated the broader implications for law enforcement and accountability. The city, shaken by the incident, was beginning to reflect on its own systems and the importance of fairness, respect, and human dignity. Judge Harris returned to her chambers, exhausted but focused. She reviewed the day's events, considered next steps, and thought about the broader lessons to be learned. She knew the officers would face disciplinary action and legal consequences, but she also understood that this confrontation had a larger purpose. It was a demonstration of the power of truth, preparation, and integrity in holding authority accountable. In private moments, she reflected on her journey. The night of humiliation had been painful, but it had also revealed strength, resilience, and clarity. She had faced fear, injustice, and personal violation, yet she had responded with dignity, fairness, and unwavering commitment to the law. She understood now more than ever that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act rightly despite it. The officers' reckoning continued beyond the courtroom. Investigations, internal reviews, and media coverage ensured that their misconduct could not be ignored. They were being held accountable not only legally but publicly, their actions scrutinized and judged by society. The confrontation had made it clear that no one is above the law, and that the consequences of abusing power are inescapable. Judge Harris prepared for the final stages of the case. Knowing that her role extended beyond this immediate confrontation, she would continue to advocate for systemic reform, for fairness, and for accountability. Her personal experience had become a catalyst for change, a lesson in how resilience, preparation, and courage could turn even a deeply unjust incident into a force for justice and reform. As night fell over the city, Judge Harris allowed herself a quiet moment. She looked out over the streets where it all had begun, thinking about the path ahead. She had faced humiliation and injustice, yet she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more committed to her principles. She understood the responsibility of power, the importance of integrity, and the necessity of standing firm even when the odds seemed daunting. The courtroom confrontation had been more than a personal vindication. It had become a symbol. It had shown that authority comes with accountability, that dignity cannot be violated without consequence, and that courage in the face of injustice can inspire change. Judge Harris knew the story was far from over, but she had already achieved something significant. She had reclaimed control, asserted justice, and reminded the city that the law serves everyone, not just those in power. And as she prepared for the next day, she felt a quiet confidence. The officers would face the consequences of their actions. The city would learn lessons about accountability and respect, and she would continue to uphold the principles that had guided her entire career. The story was not just about a single night of humiliation. It was about justice, integrity, and the enduring power of one person to turn personal suffering into a force for change. The courtroom was tense as the final day of the trial arrived. The judge walked in quietly, her presence commanding yet calm. The officers who had caused her public humiliation were already inside, fidgeting nervously, exchanging uneasy glances. They had spent weeks preparing their defense, but nothing in their training had prepared them for what was about to happen. They still did not fully understand who was presiding over their case. The judge took her seat and adjusted her robes. There was no sign of anger or revenge on her face, only the focus of someone determined to ensure that justice was done. She had spent days reviewing every detail, every report, every statement, and every piece of evidence. She knew exactly how to handle the case with fairness and authority. The courtroom fell silent as she cleared her throat and called the session to order. The first witness was brought in, a neighbor who had seen the incident from across the street. She described how she had watched the officers forcibly cut the judge's hair, the shock and fear in her eyes, and the humiliation she felt on behalf of the judge. She spoke with honesty, her voice shaking at times, but her account painted a vivid picture. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with anyone. They could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. Next came the judge's own statement. She recounted the incident in clear, measured words. She described the fear, the confusion, and the deep sense of violation she had felt when the officers had overstepped their authority. She did not yell or accuse. She simply told the truth as it had happened. Her words resonated in the room. Everyone, from the audience in the gallery to the officers themselves, felt the weight of her experience. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the officers had acted in confusion, that they did not intend to humiliate anyone, that it was an unfortunate mistake. But as they spoke, it became clear that their words carried no weight against the evidence presented. Photos, video footage, and witness testimonies all pointed to a deliberate misuse of authority. The judge listened quietly, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. As the trial continued, the officers began to realize who was presiding over their case. Their eyes widened in disbelief when they finally recognized the face of the judge before them. The moment was electric with tension. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. These were trained officers used to being in control, but now they were facing someone who had the power to hold them accountable, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Despite the personal connection, the judge remained composed. She did not let the humiliation she had suffered influence her judgment. Instead, she focused on fairness, ensuring that every piece of evidence was carefully considered, every argument given space, and every testimony heard. Her professionalism was remarkable, and even those who had doubted her ability to remain impartial could not help but be impressed. The officers gave their testimonies reluctantly. Their voices were hesitant, their explanations faltering under the weight of the evidence and the judge's calm, firm questioning. They tried to justify their actions, claiming they had been following procedure, but their answers sounded hollow. The room seemed to shrink around them as the reality of their actions became undeniable. Every word they spoke only reinforced the story of abuse of power, misconduct, and disrespect. The community watched closely. Word of the trial had spread, and people had gathered outside the courthouse to show support. Signs calling for justice and accountability waved in the crowd. Many of them had once felt helpless in the face of similar situations, but seeing the judge handle the case with integrity gave them hope. They knew that what was happening inside those walls was more than a personal battle. It was a statement about fairness, responsibility, and the rule of law. As the trial reached its climax, the judge allowed closing arguments. The prosecution outlined the evidence clearly, emphasizing the abuse of authority, the personal violation, and the importance of accountability. They spoke of the need for public trust in law enforcement and the legal system, a trust that had been shaken by this incident, but could be restored through justice. The officers' defense struggled to counter, their words weak against the undeniable facts. Finally, it was time for the verdict. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. The judge's expression remained calm, almost unreadable as she reviewed the final documents and notes. She stood slowly and all eyes turned to her. Every heart in the room seemed to beat a little faster. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying the weight of authority and fairness. The officers were found accountable for their actions. The judge explained the reasoning behind the verdict, citing the evidence, the testimonies, and the principle that no one, regardless of their position, could abuse power without consequence. The decision was firm but fair, reflecting both the severity of the misconduct and the opportunity for the officers to learn and make amends. The officers' faces were pale, their humiliation now public and official. They had faced the consequences of their actions not through anger or revenge, but through the fair and impartial application of the law. The judge's presence had transformed the trial from a simple legal proceeding into a powerful lesson on responsibility, respect, and accountability. Outside the courtroom, the community erupted in quiet celebration. People spoke of the courage it took for the judge to remain professional, despite what had happened. They shared stories of their own encounters with injustice, drawing strength from her example. The judge emerged from the courthouse to find supporters waiting. She acknowledged them with a small, tired smile, appreciating their solidarity but remaining humble, knowing that her role was to serve justice, not to seek praise. In the days that followed, the judge reflected on the incident and the trial. She considered how easily power could be misused and how important it was for systems to have checks and balances. She thought about the officers not with hatred, but with the understanding that mistakes could be corrected and lessons could be learned. She knew that true justice was not just about punishment. It was about restoring balance, teaching accountability, and preventing future harm. She also reflected on the resilience of the community, on the importance of standing up for fairness, and on the quiet strength it took to maintain dignity under pressure. The incident had been humiliating and painful, but it had also revealed the power of integrity, professionalism, and courage. She realized that her experience could inspire others to act with justice and compassion, even in difficult situations. The judge continued her work with renewed purpose. She remained a respected figure in the legal community, known not just for her rulings but for the way she handled adversity. Her story spread quietly at first, then more widely, serving as a reminder that justice could prevail even when it seemed impossible. She became a symbol of resilience, an example of how one person could uphold fairness and accountability without compromising their principles. The officers involved faced disciplinary action and retraining, and the department reviewed its procedures to prevent similar